Great. Well, we should probably kick off. Thank you for all joining us. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Rachael Oakley. I'm a UK labour lawyer with international law firm Osborne Clarke. I'm based in our San Francisco offices, working with our international clients on all their HR needs. I'm going to be the chair for the panel discussion today, and we'd love to take any questions that you have and, for it to be interactive. So please put these kind of in the chat function in the usual way. We'll either address them throughout or we can leave some till the end. As I said, we're recording, but thank you very much for joining us on this webinar. So just a bit of scene setting. So as we all know, last year businesses had to adapt at speed to remodel their workplaces, and many are now moving to embedding those temporary and often new ways of working into their permanent practices, taking forward the very best of home working and in-person working experiences. And in doing so, businesses must work through different considerations as they move forward with a resilient and people-first business model. And it's a complicated exercise in its own right. Add to that businesses are looking to tackle this issue across international locations with differing rules, regulations, and guidance. There's an awful lot for everyone to consider. I'm delighted today to be joined by three panelists to discuss some of the key legal risks and practical challenges posed by hybrid working models, in addition to looking at how best to navigate these risks to fast track future growth. So to kick off some quick introductions, I'd like to introduce Olivia Sinfield. Olivia is a partner in Osborne Clarke's UK employment team, and she has a key focus on our Future of Work initiative. Olivia has been heavily involved in advising clients, first of all, in relation to the move to remote working, and more recently in relation to moving to hybrid and new working models. She's also the presenter of our Future of Work podcast, so don't forget to sign up to that after the event as well. Philipp Raben is employment counsel in our Osborne Clarke Hamburg, Germany offices. He advises on all aspects of individual and collective labour and employment law, recently with a particular focus on future of work and hybrid working issues. And then last but by no means least, Julie Currie. Julie is Chief People Officer for Amplitude. Excitingly now a publicly trading company, Amplitude is a digital optimization system that helps businesses really understand their digital products and how customers engage with them. In her role, Julie oversees the international people team and is responsible for shaping workplace and talent strategies, employee experiences, and scaling the company culture and explosive growth. And she brings over 25 years in leadership roles across multiple technology companies and diverse industries, and has overseen company expansions, M&A, and IPOs. So we're in very good hands today. So in terms of the format, it's, as I said, a panel discussion. We don't have any slides. However, we can share some resources after the event. Before we get into that, I just wanted to put some colour into what we're seeing at the moment in terms of trends in relation to hybrid working to set the scene. So the last couple of months have been characterised with businesses starting to grapple with designing their new permanent working practices with a view to implementing them as and when local restrictions allow. And this is, of course, more difficult for international businesses who are having to grapple with restrictions and easing across multiple international locations. It's also very clear what's emerging is that the European position is very different to the US position. And while we're definitely seeing some saying a return to pre-pandemic working is their aim, I think it's fair to say that most are looking at developing a hybrid working model, which takes the best bits of home working and in-person working. And that model is a model where we expect to see at least part of the week, and sometimes we're seeing that being contractually specified, being required to be spent in the office, and where that time in the office is much more likely to be focused on collaboration, training, and innovation, with the focus more individual work element being done from home or different working environments. And it's also a situation where we're seeing people very keen to ensure that the experience, both for those in and out of the office, is comparable and inclusive. And this has really put a heavy focus on digital inclusion and tech, as well as health and safety in the home working environment. I think it's also fair to say that we've already seen some have already implemented or are implementing a work from anywhere model, which has great advantages in terms of recruitment and retention, but brings with it additional complexities, not least the issue of tax. So with that scene setting, everybody's heard enough of my voice. I'd like to invite panelists to join me in discussing some of the key issues today. So I think first, to kick things off, I'd love to hear from Olivia and Philipp and ask you to give us a bit of a brief overview of where we are at the minute and what you're seeing in each of the UK and Germany in terms of hybrid working approaches and return to the office. Because I know it certainly feels like there was this grand idea that everything would start to open up from a work perspective from September onwards. But is that what you're seeing happening in practice? Olivia, shall I ask you to go first?
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, Rachel. And good morning, everyone, but good afternoon from the UK. So I particularly like the expression that the workforce of the future came early to the party. And I think it's a pretty decent overview of the position in the UK, as in most jurisdictions. So where we're at the moment is it is clear that hybrid is the now and future model of choice. So most of the polls that we're seeing in the UK are coming out at around about 30%. Oh, sorry, I think somebody may not be on mute. It's always when you then hear people's small children and animals in the background. That's better. So yeah, in terms of poll results, about 30%, and I appreciate it is a generalisation, of businesses are saying that they expect to have their workforces fully back by 2023. So the majority of businesses over here are working towards a return to the workplace for employees in some shape or form this year, but they very much, as Rachel said, don't anticipate a return to a pre-pandemic full-time in-office working practice. So how this is playing out in terms of timings, well, we very much saw the foot being taken off the pedal over the summer in terms of businesses getting people back in. That was because of holidays, not everybody over here was double jabbed, and because of the number of COVID cases. And implementation was really being planned to start in earnest from September, and that was supposed to tie in with the relaxation of social distancing measures and self-isolation requirements. Now, what we've seen since September is that process hasn't been as full speed ahead as we anticipated, largely because of concern of transmission even amongst those who are vaccinated, and because the government announced at the back end of August that at some point during the autumn we're likely to go into what they're calling stage 3, where this will involve stricter protective measures and possibly a further lockdown. So that resulted in a degree of nervousness on the part of businesses who don't want to bring people back in only for there to be all change again and having to send them home further down the line. So I think it's fair to say what we're seeing at the moment is a cautious return to office working with very much no one size fits all, but it's still, and really importantly, very much being led by what employees want and feel comfortable with, rather than any edict from above from businesses in terms of what they should do. So that's kind of on the business side. On the employee side, and again, generalizing somewhat around poll results, we're seeing a similar split between workers who want to work on a hybrid basis, and that's sitting around about 45%, with the other 55% of people who are wanting to work either exclusively from their homes or from office locations. And of those exclusive workers, the majority, and maybe somewhat surprisingly, are actually preferring and wanting to be in the workplace rather than working from their homes. So the really big challenge we're seeing over here for businesses and for clients we're talking to is how they balance those competing interests, wants and needs to really find a model that works. And that's a really real challenge at the moment, because it is a buyer's job market. We're seeing really high job attrition rates, and something of a disconnect between businesses who see hybrid working as something of a benefit, which could be overruled by things like poor performance and work priorities, as compared to employees who are seeing it as something as a right. So there's sort of two ends of a seesaw, and we're very much looking to try and find that ideal equilibrium. So I hope that gives you some flavour of what's happening in the UK, and I'll hand over to Philipp from the German perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. Yeah, I can say it's quite remarkable that regardless of the maybe different situations with regard to COVID, but also maybe the different like legal perspective, it's kind of almost the same. So we as we talked about, so I don't want to go into like the detailed percentages, but what we see especially is, yeah, a couple of like part of the workforce wanting to remain working from home full time, part of the workforce wanting to go back to the office, and maybe the majority having, you know, being in between, so wanting to be flexible first and foremost. And yeah, and the big challenges for the employers at this time is to balance these interests by keeping everybody, you know, happy or at least content with their current working model on the one hand, but on the other hand, meeting their business needs, which is, yeah, just became a lot more since like all the flexibility is going around at the moment. It becomes a lot more difficult than before, because before the rule was for like I don't know 90 or 85% was okay, my workplace is at the office, and there might be an exception of a couple of days per month where I can work remotely, like for the typical white collar employee. And that has changed so much, and a lot of the like upper management still kind of, I think that the biggest progress I've seen in the past year is like kind of the thinking in the HR departments. So because I think like the upper management sometimes is still holding on to the idea, you know, once this has all passed, we go back to what was happening before. But the HR people now at the moment are very, you know, close to the employees and to the employees' needs, and therefore you know, they see that it will not go back to where it was. Yeah, so this is kind of the situation at the moment with regard to the COVID restrictions. I think Germany is quite unrestricted at the moment. You have to go to the office, and you don't even have to get tested, so you just need to wear a mask in social areas. So I think this is not a big issue at the moment that we are talking about.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you both for that, like, the insights from like a more legal perspective. And Julie, I'd love to hear from you kind of where Amplitude are at the moment in terms of your current return to work position, or, you know, where you are in your plans for thinking about what that future of work looks like, or hybrid working.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I actually very much resonate with Olivia's comments, as well as Philipp's comments to a degree as well, in terms of what transpired. So very similar. I think many companies had put out their plans to be what we'll call return to site, not just work, because we are working, aren't we, wherever we are. And so return to site, to our location. And, you know, companies have put out a timeline. The September-October timeline was what we were seeing. And as we approached and as we saw Delta take hold in the late summer, you know, that there was that sort of denial process happening at first, and then a quick response to maybe this isn't the best time, as well as certainly surveying employees often and hearing the voice of the employees that they did not feel safe. It was too quick. Getting used to the home and the things that, you know, have been benefited from working at home is not something that people want to depart. And a culmination for us was more than 97% of employees did not want to come back full time. And so it was gravitating to like 2 to 3 days. And we ran the survey in the summer, so it's been a while, but it was loud and clear, sort of people not wanting to go back to what was. That being said, I also share with people openly that there was a lot of work being done with Deloitte or Burson prior to us going into COVID around the new workforce, and the future of work was a topic before COVID. And the millennials and Gen Z and Gen Y really wanted to have more flexibility in their work life. And so I think like the digital age, that COVID just accelerated that and propelled us into a different way of thinking and a different way of working with lots of resistance. So, Philipp talks about the people function sort of adapting, but there is still very much, as I speak to my colleagues, that push and pull going on out there around people wanting to resume what was, because it's fuzzy and it's unclear sort of how the new workplace will take shape and the leadership capabilities or the environment or just the operationalization of that. And so I think that people are still very much grappling with that. My previous employer, we worked right through, we were a manufacturer. And so we got quite agile in terms of having a workforce working through all of COVID and how we stayed safe. And more recently, Rachael mentioned for Amplitude, we went public just last week. And we brought our workforce together, and it was a lot of questions. So we brought our workforce together in New York and surrounding areas, and we ended up having a celebratory event last Friday with over 600 people present. And the success that we found in that is we actually put in above and beyond measures than what is required. And so there's what local governments will require, there's what the CDC will require, and then there was what Amplitude required for us to make sure that our employees, their families and their communities were safe, and all on a volunteer basis. And so we did require testing. And so it was, you had to have, every single event had a testing station, and people had to wear their bands, and vaccination is required at Amplitude. And so I know there's some controversy around that. It's challenging for me to navigate those types of discussions with our European counterparts and overseas counterparts. It's an ongoing discussions because we're still in volunteer mode. And so that balance between what the employer would like to do to keep the employees safe versus what local requirements is something we, I talk with outside counsel on a frequent basis. I'm also starting to get a push more so from Asia and Europe to come back in office. And so I think that the leading indicators is more, whereas North America is holding back, European and Asia are begging me to let them come back in into the office. And, we feel that how do we sort of determine that safety protocols of like limited numbers, limited days, so that we can do effective tracking and get people to voluntarily want to do the extra safety precautions so that we don't become a workplace of spread. So I think we're in the middle of that. In North America, how I'm thinking about it at this time is, given that we had a successful gathering in the process that we did it, we are trying to see, can we have small teams come together? We feel the human contact and the feedback, the overwhelming feedback we've received from employees coming back together and what it meant for them socially is just it was super powerful. And so we have our phased approach, and we're looking at letting team building exercise happen in very small numbers, 10 to 20. A preferred outdoor. Our event last Friday was outdoors. And if you're indoors in California, you have to wear masks anyways. So we stay distanced and we stay masked from a safety perspective, but we're about to try it on. And so Olivia, the balance is that in North America, we're entering Thanksgiving season. And I've talked to all of you about, do you have a similar event that transpires? So in the US, it's everyone travels. And so millions of kids leave the college and come home and interact in large family gatherings. And we have seen historically that this is where the spread has taken place. So we're cautious. We're watching the medical professionals advise on, do they expect to have a spike? And so my goal, whether it's wise or not, is to try to create some gatherings between now and American Thanksgiving, which is at the end of November, to create more than 50% of our workforce is new because of our growth. So many people have not seen, met, or experienced our culture and our environment within. So, we're just talking about it the past couple days on, can we do this safely? Can we run a Halloween event outside? Our leaders have sort of taken matters into their own hands as well, and are having offsites into outdoor places, following the same protocols that we followed for our celebratory events. And I'm working with our European counterparts to say, how can we have a plan to help people come back safely outside Halloween celebrations, and then 10 to 12 people, every other day, a different group, so we can do contact tracing. So that's in current discussions and process and early stages of implementation.
No, that sounds great. It's really helpful to hear kind of what stage you're at with it practically. And I know you touched upon the topic of vaccinations, and I don't think it would be right for us to have this conversation without going into that in probably a little bit more detail, even though it's an area that's kind of constantly evolving. Because I know it's been such a flashpoint in the US, because inoculation rates remain quite low relative to some European countries. And earlier this month, Joe Biden announced a policy directing all federal employees and contractors to be vaccinated, with those refusing potentially facing dismissal, as well as a plan to require workers at medium-sized or large companies with over 100 staff to be vaccinated or tested for the virus weekly. Now, this is very different to across most of Europe, and the process there. Philipp, would you be able to give us a bit of an overview of the position in Germany relating to employee vaccinations?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's very much evolving. So right now I will just be talking about like the main issues that are kind of fixed at the moment. It's even different sometimes in our different states, because we also have different states, just as the US. Yeah, let's start with the first issue. Would be, from my perspective, the question about the vaccination status, because I think this is kind of like the starting point. And this question can be asked, so it's not discriminatory to ask that question, which there are questions that are actually already discriminatory. But the main issue is it doesn't have to be answered by the employees. So it's quite a worthless, it can be quite a worthless question. A lot of people don't know this, but not every question by the employer have to be answered by the employee. What's the reason behind that? One can guess. Obviously, it's our precious GDPR, which you've all probably heard of. So the data security, because we are talking about the issue of very sensitive personal data, because it's health data, and because of vaccination data, there can be this is considered to be health data in any case. So generally speaking, you can ask the question, you don't get an answer. If the employees decides to kind of hold back on that, there are, however, some exceptions with regard to medical personnel. Yeah, back on that. So like, what is more, obviously, if there's not a normally people don't have to get vaccinated. There are exceptions with regard to medical personnel. There is a duty to get vaccinated. Also, there can be the question about the vaccination has to be answered in schools and kindergartens for the employees, and correctly, and then the management can decide what to do with unvaccinated persons. So this is kind of like this is kind of like the official guideline at the moment. Also, what is now in discussion is kind of for people who are not vaccinated and get put into quarantine because they have a positive test or for another reasons. that they don't get paid, which they are at the moment getting paid by the state for the time of the quarantine, their salary. But the discussion is very high about this to change in order to incentivize people to get vaccinated. So yeah, this is kind of like the general approach.
No, that's great. And Olivia, do you think there's any particular differences in the position in the UK? And also, it'd be great if you've got any kind of insights on how, you know, international companies may be able to approach this issue, which is obviously very different everywhere.
Yeah, and I think it probably comes as no surprise if I say that our experience in the UK is different to that in the US. More similarities with what Philipp's described, particularly in respect to the legal considerations that apply. So I won't talk about those, but just to kind of give you a overview of what's happening in the UK in respect of vaccinations. So we don't have any official government workplace mandate here other than just in relation to care homes and healthcare settings. And we've seen recently some sort of fairly severe flip-flopping by the government in relation to the use of COVID passports. So there's been some backpedaling from the initial requirements that venues with large crowds, so mainly thinking about concerts, theatres, that sort of thing, but also covering events like yours, Julie, that you described, which sounded wonderful, by the way. And the idea there was that from September, anyone attending those sort of events would have to present proof of full vaccination, but that's now been scrapped. So against that sort of context, we've only really seen outlier businesses, mainly where larger international organisations where there is a US interest, or businesses where close contact is absolutely unavoidable, and particularly involving sort of higher risk individuals, introduce mandatory vaccination policies. And generally, except for those outlier cases where there's particular reasons sort of dictating that, it is a scenario that we've advised against. With other clients, we've seen, but still on a fairly limited and conservative basis, the collection of vaccination data where it's considered necessary for sort of health and safety reasons. So, for example, to ensure that those coming into the office are exempt from the self-isolation requirements, or again, where work involves really close contact. But the most common practice we're seeing, and Rachel, you mentioned about an approach that would work internationally, and I think this approach does, is where additional sort of elevated health and safety measures are required, adopting and enforcing a really sort of stringent testing regime, and either running this on trust via employees self-attesting to their testing status, or requiring sight of COVID passports, so checking testing status or vaccination status, but not actually collecting the data, because that then means that we don't have to get into that minefield of data protection considerations that Philipp was mentioning.
Yeah, I can
maybe
see.
Just
sorry,
to add,
Philipp.
maybe just to add what we are seeing right now is our vaccination premiums, which I think would also be something to be considered, like for all jurisdictions probably. In Germany, they don't have to be, they cannot be too high. So I would say like 100 euros, okay, but anything more would then amount to kind of like, you know, people who don't get vaccinated, kind of force them to get vaccinated, like, you know, through that. But I think that I was, just because you were mentioning what could be an international approach, I think that could be probably an international approach, but happy to discuss.
Yeah, so it's more on the encouragement side of things rather than mandating. Okay, that makes sense. And I've seen Julie nodding along to a few of those things. This is clearly like something that you've been considering in the terms of kind of events that you've been thinking about. And there's no right or wrong answer here. You know, we appreciate businesses that are international need to take a very commercial approach. Are you able to share with us what you're thinking in terms of potentially return to the office regarding vaccinations?
Yes, so where we can, we've made the decision for vaccination requirements, but to Olivia's point is we're not collecting the data, so we're not storing it. So with our events, people are just presenting it. In one of our events, our employees could upload, but the information was destroyed after the event. And we had significant others, and so we didn't collect their data. They just had to present on their phone or in person, along with their home test if they had conducted it. In other countries, some areas are easier. So Singapore, last I checked, had 88% vaccinations, and the country as a whole has had such strict measures, and their tracking and their passport system really made it more amenable for us to navigate back to the workplace. And so really where the greatest challenges are is participation and volunteerism, where it makes sense in our European offices. And we're really working with the teams to help them come up with what works for them and what's acceptable, because we are not in this where we get some legal advices. At this point, no government has required companies to allow people to go back to work. And so we're not sort of in breach of contracts. And so there's no hurry necessarily for employers to take risks, or for employees who aren't yet comfortable to have to come. And then irrespective, we've actually started to work around a hybrid environment, and we've looked at the personas and the work that people do to say, going forward, do people actually need to be in the office? So we have a very big sales presence in our European locations. And the question is, what roles will lend themselves more to being in the office and what roles don't lend themselves to being into the office? And so there's that. At this moment, as I said, a lot of the appetite to come back is either where people don't have appropriate privacy at home and are eager to sort of like have an external place to go to and concentrate, or it's that contact to be and interact with colleagues. And so we are not requiring any things that are out of requirements, but we've also not let people go back. So because we can't do it. So we're trying to figure out. And so the likely is we'll do what we can do from a precaution, and we'll keep groups of people very small and see if we can get some small wins along the way.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing, Julie. And moving on to another topic, something we've seen come up with more and more frequency in this new way of working is this idea of a work from anywhere model, where employees can quite literally move from one place to another doing their same job. Olivia, could you highlight for us some of the general kind of legal issues that are presented with this work from anywhere model?
Yeah, of course. And we did see this exit last year when a lot of employees left the UK to either return to their home countries or preferred place of work, and now are approaching their employers and saying they want to stay there. And the situation's changed because that was fine as a temporary measure, temporary stop last year, and we saw our tax authorities and courts on the employment side giving a fair amount of license and breathing space to businesses to enable that to happen. But the position's different now that that is becoming, and businesses are looking for competitive reasons, as you say, Raymond, in your comment in the chat, at implementing these working from anywhere models. So the message we're trying to get out there is that this sort of modelling does require quite a bit of pre-thought and planning, mainly because on the legal side of the employment and tax implications. So there may be the situation where employers have to operate payrolls and pay tax and meet social security obligations outside of, say, the UK, if somebody is tax resident in another jurisdiction. Ongoing working abroad as well might expose the business to the risk of creating a permanent establishment with tax like implications such as liabilities on profits outside the jurisdiction, or an obligation to register and charge VAT locally. And then as well, there may be an obligation to obtain local operating licenses and work permits. So there are a whole host of issues to consider on the tax side. Then you turn to the employment side, and even there, notwithstanding what your contract of employment says, which employment laws apply depend upon the individual's actual connection to that jurisdiction they're working from. So it may be inadvertently businesses find that they're subject to mandatory local employment laws, which actually they know nothing about. And then it's very easy to fall foul of these. You've then got the big issue, which is often overlooked in terms of whether employers' liability insurance covers employees who are working abroad. And I'm not sure what the position is in other jurisdictions, but in the UK, we're finding that often it doesn't. So going back to where I started from, it requires really careful planning and looking at the legal position, both in the jurisdictions people are moving from and the legal position in the jurisdictions they're moving to. And the approach, because of that really we recommend is allowing employees to request working from anywhere, but not imposing upon yourselves an obligation to agree to it, or putting in place a model where there are parameters around working abroad. So, for example, individuals are allowed to work abroad for up to between, say, 3 to 6 months a year, and that then reduces risk on both the employment and the tax side.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And Julie, is the work from anywhere model something that Amplitude is considering, and or are you putting in place any of those types of parameters that Olivia mentioned in terms of kind of where employees can work?
Yes and yes. So when we first went home, if you like, is we did change, like employees, like many places went home, and home wasn't necessarily where home was before, to new locations. And we changed the status with the expectations that, you know, people would return at some point. And so, yes, we recognized the tax implications of what that might mean for individuals in different states, or we haven't had as many in different countries. However, to answer the second part of that question, and this is part of our navigating, what is our position on return to site? And we've chosen a position of flex, and not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not completely remote. So we're not a remote first organization at this point. We are a flex first, which means we're going to be providing flexibility for people to come in a different number of days into the organizations. We did an acquisition at the beginning of the summer of a small group of people of 15, where they were 100% distributed and very distributed, never together, all over the world, far-reaching countries. We've maintained that group to operate that way, but specifically for our engineering organization, we have stated that we would like them to be where our design centers are within commute distance of where our 2 design centers are at the moment, with a flex model. With, you know, they don't need to come in all the time. And then about 10 to 15% of that group who are seasoned managers performing, can manage from remote. We put on a trial to say some people, a smaller population, can leave remotely. And we've also made a big, broad statement that in context of our values around growth mindset and humility, we recognize that we don't have the answers, and this will be a year of learning for us, and that will continue to evolve as we move through the different phases of flex work and what's going to be right for organizations and how companies will adjust. And so we've yet to know whether companies will move more towards remote or actually move more back to on-site a year and a half, 2 years from now. So we're staying just very fluid on what works best for the competitive landscape for talent and the successful culture and leadership that we need to scale a company at a very rapid pace.
I feel like we've coordinated, Julie, because you give me a great segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is just, you know, in terms of this kind of creating an environment of flexibility with employees in this new way of working, because we know that that seems to be a key kind of factor in employee satisfaction at the moment. And I think this is something a lot of businesses are thinking about in the current market, where there's this really kind of high talent war at the moment. We've also got at the moment what's being dubbed the Great Resignation. And I was reading earlier this week, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, 4 million Americans quit their jobs in July 2021. The resignations peaked in April and have remained abnormally high for the last couple of months. There was a record-breaking 10.9 million open jobs at the end of July. So I think a lot of employers are grappling with this idea of kind of how to retain people in the face of this kind of tidal wave of resignations. And it's possible that this flexibility is the new currency of what people are going to be looking at. So I think you've probably touched on some issues there, Julie, but I'd love, any kind of thoughts that you have as well in a practical perspective based on your experience at Amplitude or elsewhere. What can businesses be doing in this kind of market to attract, recruit, and then retain the best talent and really kind of differentiate themselves in this kind of competitive market?
It's a great question. And I think companies are all over the place on this topic. We are seeing in some cases declines in offers having to do with people who want, even if their role can be flexible, if their teammates are not, they don't want the difference. It's either everybody is or not. So it depends is really the answer. I don't think we have figured it out, to be honest with you. Rachel, I was reading this morning an article as well on what can be what can we expect? And the CEO of Morgan Stanley or Chase made a comment of he recognizes that everybody doesn't like commuting, but that's too bad. And so like there sits an extreme of like, great, heard you, ignoring you. We're still like moving forward as a business and doing what we need to do to be a business. And then you have some other companies, maybe it's someone like a Microsoft, who have said our culture is really important to us, but we hear you employees and they've got such large scale, but you all need to be in the office 3 days a week. And so we've had that. And so I think different companies are trying on what they believe is best for their organizations, and employees have choice because it's an extremely aggressive market right now.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the businesses that are just talking the talk and those who are kind of putting it into practice, isn't there? And employees are going to suss that out sooner or later and pick the ones that are going to give them the best options, because benefits are kind of changing at the moment.
I think so, yeah.
And I think
Rachel,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Rachel.
No,
I was
no.
going to say, so one thing we're seeing over here is a lot of businesses turning very quickly to quick fixes to try and turn that great attrition into the great attraction, and by doing things like ramping up pay very quickly without really looking at the real reason why people are wanting to leave. So whilst it's very tempting to do that, I think the problem is that creates very much a transactional relationship between employer and employee and doesn't really address the real issue or strengthen those relational ties, which Julie was talking about as well. So I think fundamentally what they need to do is really get to the heart of that question: what are employees running from and what are they gravitating to be able to come up with what we need in terms of being a really well crafted and well thought through employer value proposition.
Yeah, that's great. And again, that kind of leads on to what I wanted to talk about in terms of employee well-being, mental health. I think, burnout across employees has been, really under the microscope. And I think it's going to have to continue to be. And I think that's, again, a reason why employees might be shifting between different companies. Philipp, from your perspective, what do you think are some of the kind of legal risks for businesses in terms of mental health and well-being of employees if they get it wrong?
Yes, interesting topic. I'm very interested to hearing what you are saying, Olivia and Julie, because I think it's always, from my experience, it's always like the UK and the US being like a little quicker in like, future things with regard to employment law, maybe in general, but especially with regard to employment law. So I think that we are still talking about Germany, and clocks are maybe ticking a little late with regard to like, adapting to new realities. I think maybe that might change with the new government, but it used to be like very, old-fashioned with a lot of these things. So coming back to hybrid and, and now with regard to the mental health and well-being issue, I think it's a big issue, but it's, it's kind of not being thought through in the right. I'm a big I try to promote that issue as like a selling point for employers a lot, because it's more, oh yeah, we have a doctor that, you know, addresses things or stuff like that, but you know, that's not the way to start it. So I think it's kind of, but we are seeing it right now to being a part of like becoming more part of the HR strategy. So that having been said, the legal liability, because the issue is not that is not that, you know, striking at the moment. I think that the courts have also not really adapted to that. I mean, there might be extreme cases, you know, where you put too much work, or don't give supply assistance to specific employees, then you might be liable. But these cases are very, very, very rare at the moment in Germany. So I think we're kind of at the start of employers resonating now. They're, you know, they thought about hybrid work, they have now implemented, or some of them have now implemented that, and now they're kind of starting to think about legal health in combination with you know, the challenges of working from home or working hybridly. So I think I think this is probably a topic for the next year in Germany, and it's starting right now, but it's not that, you know, it's not that striking at the moment. So it's more me talking to clients about what they should do, and it's not the client too much already.
No, that's really
reflecting.
Interesting, because I think there's the opportunity now for kind of businesses to be more proactive in this, which I think we're probably seeing more from the US, which sounds like kind of Germany needs to catch up. I'll ask Julie a question on this in a second, but just a reminder, you know, in the last 10 minutes, if anybody does have any questions, pop those into the chat function. We'll try to address those. And then just circling back to you, Julie, at Amplitude, I know you're very kind of people-centric. Are there any kind of initiatives that you've put in place from a mental health well-being perspective that you think have worked well, or, you know, conversely, anything that's not? And are you kind of leveraging employee feedback to develop your strategy on that front as well?
Yes, definitely. We're about to launch our next engagement survey, but, you know, again, it starts with the voice of the employees. There has been a large momentum in the workplace, I think, to focus on the employee and the employee well-being, and a recognition of how taxing it is to be on Zoom calls all day. Very fatiguing.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, whether it's this call or any other, it's you know, especially for people who are introverted, for example, is like that constant on is tough. And then everything that happened at home, like, you know, when you quoted the statistics, Rachel, about people exiting the workplace, a lot of those were women, right? And so it was the inability to balance, it wasn't worth it, right? You know, you had your kids at home, you had teenagers who were going through depression because removal from their social aspects, and these real macro issues that were very challenging. So what, you know, we've done a lot is we've put in additional services for mental health, and globally, where people have, you know, 6 sessions or online coaching, or a large repository of tools and trainings on a multitude of topics, and we roll them out with relevancy. We've implemented unplugged days on a quarterly basis. Some of our team members have no video days, for example, and working in a flexible environment, and, you know, letting people get work done to work around their families and whatnot are some of the things that we have done. There's probably a whole host of other things, but just trying to be adaptive, and some, you know, I think a lot of that will just stay, and it'll stay with us going forward.
No, that's great. And I think you touched on a really important area as well. You know, there's been particular people who have been disproportionately affected by what's happened over the last year. You know, you highlighted more women are leaving their jobs. And whilst that's also happened, in some ways, remote working has also been a great equalizer for remote workers, because we've all been forced to kind of be in the same boat. And I think that really touches on, you know, diversity and inclusion generally in the workforce, and how that has to be kind of front and center as we move forward in this more kind of human-centric way of working. And you know, it's not just people living to work. We're trying to make, you know, work more adaptable for people. Olivia, to pick on you, because it's been a while since I've heard from you. big topic. Do you think a challenge or opportunity for kind of diversity and inclusion in this hybrid working world that we're moving to?
Oh, big question, Rachael. We could do a whole session just on that alone. I think we have to see it as a challenge, opportunity, sorry, and be positive about this. I think just reflecting first for a moment, I think what hybrid working has done in relation to D&I is really sort of build on what COVID started last year in terms of chipping away our traditional understanding of what diversity and inclusion actually means and actually is, which is a good thing. So it used to be seen as being about creating equity on the basis of those protected characteristics like race, gender, etc. Whereas now it's clear it has that much broader reach, and it's about creating a level playing field for everybody for reward and advancement, regardless of any variables. And hybrid working has put a new variable in the mix in terms of some people in the office and some people working from home, and then layer on that the fact that a lot of people working from home are women or carers or those with health conditions. It really demonstrates that D&I is now more than ever a really broad church. So it all comes down to the importance for businesses of making sure that everybody feels connected and has the same opportunities, and going back to what Julie says, has that same employee experience. But I think in terms of it being an opportunity, clearly there's the ability now for businesses to reach into a much more diverse and wider talent pool, which is great for D&I. However, there are still some problems and challenges within that, because that diverse talent pool needs to have diverse people and diverse teams dipping into it. Otherwise, there's just going to be recruitment of carbon copies of ourselves. And that's really challenging with the restraints of existing workforces, especially with those high attrition rates we were talking about. So there's a lot of focus, I know, in terms of the clients we're talking to around how they can recruit fairly and how they can avoid any bias in those recruitment processes.
Yeah, I think that idea of kind of almost like a proximity bias is going to come to play as we move into, having a more hybrid workforce, because we're still predominantly more remote than not. And I think tech is going to have to play, a really big and important role in that. And we've seen businesses move really quickly to implement new technology to kind of enable that transition to effective remote working. And I think particularly where that technology involves some kind of element of monitoring, there's a bit of an issue there. I know you've kind of spoken to a few clients about that, Olivia. Do you want to just give us some thoughts on kind of monitoring technology?
Yeah, so we've seen a real uptick in clients sort of using monitoring technology sort of in various ways. So software that monitors mouse clicks or keystrokes, or spyware in terms of website usage, and even recording of screens without people knowing. So legally, and I think this is across the board and certainly within other jurisdictions in Europe, it's a really tricky area, because employees aren't expressly permitted to monitor, but nor are they expressly prohibited from doing so. And instead, we've got this kind of wealth of case law and legislation like the Human Rights Act, the GDPR as well. Philipp touched on that earlier on. So to distill it down, what it all comes down to is whether there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. And in our new way of working with people working from homes, it's easier for employees to establish that there is that expectation of privacy when they're working in their own four walls. So there is now more than ever a real need for businesses to be crystal clear in contracts and in policies in terms of what they're doing, and being transparent about it for data protection purposes as well. So it is an area of increasing focus going forwards.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Philipp, are there kind of any particular nuances to that topic in Germany? I know in terms of kind of GDPR obligations, Germany is up there.
Everything is forbidden. No.
Doom and gloom. Okay, well, I mean, that answers my question.
No, not entirely, but yeah, but there are very, very strong boundaries. For example, something like, you know, what you can actually do with Office 365 is very hard to implement in Germany, especially when you have a works council. Because yeah, as you know, in GDPR, you always need some kind of grounds for processing this kind of data and monitoring. And so like a general one size fits all monitoring of everything, as Olivia mentioned, with regard to keystrokes or mouse movement or whatever, would be too would be too invasive in that regard. So it's something that has to be determined for every tool, but generally speaking, you should be very careful in Germany. Yeah, because I haven't mentioned the fines in the GDPR, but they're up to 4% of the world revenue for a company group. So that's quite high.
Yeah, the consequences of getting it wrong are quite severe, aren't they? And I'm conscious of time. Just quickly, G, on the topic of technology, is there anything like Amplitude's put in place to help remote working that you think now you won't be able to live without?
Well, that's a great question. I think we've adopted so many tools, but I think there's also a lot of tools that are in development that will continue. The challenge thing is, how will these tools, whether it be Zoom or our whiteboarding exercises on Miro or something like that, will we continue to use? And so one of the challenges in the hybrid world, of course, is inclusion. And I think that there's a lot of different approaches to that as well in the workplace, and that tools may continue to enable us to be inclusive and to get participation and hear people's voices. Where I'm also looking at advances in technology is operationalizing the back to work, sort of like the systems that track, the systems that can create collaboration and visibility for who are your colleagues that are in. Do you want to sit together? Do you want to share? I think that might play an important role in when people do come together. They're coming in here not to sit in a cubicle, but really to interact. And I was going to say something else about our collaborative tools. I think from a tracking perspective, space planning, but I don't know, like, I think that yes, we've all become more savvy in leveraging tools, and including trying to get into a Zoom when I don't have the right link, right? So.
Hey, that one's probably more on me than you, don't worry.
No, that's on me.
But we got there in the end. No, that's really helpful, and you know, brings us perfectly up to kind of one minute before the end of our session. I know everybody's time is valuable, and we could talk about this topic all day. You know, we've only just touched upon some of the key themes. It's been a really great discussion. Thank you so much to my three panelists for sharing your insights and, you know, your really different perspectives on these key issues that we're all grappling with at the moment, because there really is no right or wrong answer. Everyone's trying to learn at the same time. I know I've taken a lot away from all the practical examples, and thank you everybody else for joining us this morning. We'll, as I said, we'll be able to share some materials in relation to hybrid working by way of follow-up. But if you've got any thoughts, questions, comments, please do feel free to reach out to any of us. You know, we'd be very happy to help. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. I think unless anybody else has any questions, it's been really great to see you all. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your days.